All right, we're going to go through a quick summary of Chapter 15, which really focuses on immigration and migration. And so, in the effects that had on both cities and politics, because there are going to be lasting effects kind of in both areas. So, if we look at immigration and migration, if we look at the immigration piece of that, um, poverty and persecution in Europe and other places are going to cause millions of people to leave Europe, Japan, China, the Caribbean, and Mexico, and head for the United States. And again, there's a litany of reasons why in each one of these countries, that they're looking to, or areas they're looking to get out of. We mentioned in class, and we talked about how um, in Europe, we have groups that were religiously persecuted, mainly the Jews that looked to immigrate. We had the potato famine in Ireland that really made it a necessity for a lot of Irish to immigrate and leave Ireland because there simply was no food there. Um, so if we were to sum up though, kind of one word, what they're looking for that American dream that just could not be achieved in the countries of their origin. And so people are looking to leave. They're looking for opportunities. They're looking for a better life. Um, these immigrants, as they leave the country, before they can go into the United States, they have to go through a rather lengthy um, um, evaluation process, we'll call it. On the West Coast, we had Angel Island, and on the East Coast, we had Ellis Island. And all the immigrants in the country were forced to go through some sort of evaluation that said, legally, are you who you say you are? And then medically, are you bringing with you any kind of harmful diseases? And if you were not eligible to enter the country, you were oftentimes detained at Ellis Island for a time period and then sometimes sent home. And so, there's all kinds of stories of immigrants and their stories of going through Ellis Island and how sometimes, it wasn't the best experience. But again, to them, it was worth it to get into the United States and to really pursue the American dream. Um, Once arriving into the United States, um, most immigrants are going to be kind of forced to adopt a new language and culture, that American culture in the English language. For some, they don't speak English, and the United States was not as open to that then as it is today. And so immigrants, if they wanted to be successful, had to learn English. They had to kind of adopt and assimilate to the American culture in some respects. Um, so you are going to have some groups that are committed to to their own culture, but again, they're trying hard to grow into their new identities of being an American. Um, and this is also the era of the hyphenated American, if you will, and that was their way of hanging on to their culture. So you were Irish American or Italian American or German American, and so you're putting that hyphenated word in front from wherever you were from, and it helped you be connected to that to your homeland. However, um, when we look at that, many native born people didn't like that notion. Um, Many native born people in the United States thought of the United States as more of a melting pot. In that melting pot analogy that I'm sure that you're familiar with, that mixture of different cultures and races that blended together, abandoned their own abandoned their old languages, their old customs, and adopted the new ones. Um, this is kind of counterintuitive to what the immigrants wanted when they got here. They didn't want to give up what they were, and for a brief time period, we've got a growth here in the United States of something known as nativism. Nativism is one of your vocab terms, um, and all it's referring to is a favoritism towards native-born people. Um, so, and for the most part, these nativists didn't really object um, to English-born or even some Germanic ancestors. They thought those were superior ethnic groups. It would have been those from Eastern Europe that they really started to object to, and it gives rise to kind of an anti-immigration movement in the United States, where they're saying, hey, the problems are because of these immigrants coming in the country. So it wasn't necessarily the best mark in our history. There's also, during this time period, a great deal of anti-Asian sentiment in the country. A lot of that had to do with, again, they looked different, their culture's different. Um, so uh, again, we have something that's known as the Chinese Exclusion Act being passed to exclude the number of Chinese that got into the country. And again, uh, a lot of this anti-Asian sentiment was along the West Coast, where most of our Asian immigrants were. Um, but it was very much built out of that fear of the unknown. It was the fear of their culture's different, they look different, and they're taking jobs from native-born people. So that plays into that nativist agreement. Um, we also had something known as the Gentleman's Agreement. That was another limiting factor in immigration. Basically, that had to do with Japan. And Japan limiting immigration to the United States, limiting unskilled workers to the United States. So, there's kind of some play back and forth with that. Um, we also have some changes in our agriculture. With the industrialization, you need less people working in the fields, and so that leads to more people moving to cities in search for jobs and in search for opportunities. When we have things like McCormick's Reaper, the steel plow, farming becomes more efficient, and when we need fewer laborers, so people are going to move to the cities. Um, Again, many of these immigrants and migrants, when they move into the cities, they're going to face discrimination in their efforts to find jobs and housing. It's just kind of the way it is. And so we're going to have different groups at different times step in and try to address those things. Which we have things like the social gospel movement, settlement houses, Jane Addams, that come in and try to address some of the problems of the new immigrants, as well as some of the problems that were associated with urbanization. Because again, as the influx of immigrants and migrants move into cities, you have a population boom in these cities, and these cities are not necessarily well equipped to deal with it. And so, housing, transportation, water, and sanitation are all going to be stretched to the limit. And so, again, we have these reformers that go in and try to fix a lot of these urban problems. Again, if we look at housing, we had cities that just didn't have adequate housing, and you had tenements that basically were formed, and these were overcrowded, unsanitary. Jacob Riles has some famous photographs showing a lot of these conditions in cities, and so if you have a time to scroll through the PowerPoint lecture notes, you can see kind of some of the conditions people lived in. With transportation, we start to see some of the uh, developments of mass transit to help alleviate some of those issues. Um, Cities face numerous problems as far as trying to provide safe drinking water, and so cities had to make some adjustments in how they were going to do that, and just converting things to indoor plumbing, those types of things. Um, so we've got advances in that. Same with sanitation. Oftentimes, this was a period kind of before cars, and so your main mode of transportation is horses, or are horses, and oftentimes, you'd have manure and things like that piling up on the streets. You had open sewage gutters. I mean, you didn't have underground sewers, and so that was an issue. You didn't have regular trash pickup. I mean, just unsanitary places at times. You've with crime was an issue in those bigger cities, and then also fire, and that kind of touches home a little bit with the fire in the old market not too long ago. But you had buildings that were largely made of wood. If one caught fire, those fires often kind of spread, and so these are all challenges with urbanization. And again, we try to fix those through some social movements. Again, with the social gospel movement, that preached salvation through service to the poor. So it inspired many to kind of help the poor. In the late 1800s, we have the establishment of settlement houses, which are basically just community centers in slum neighborhoods that provide assistance to area in the neighborhood. So kind of like a YMCA almost. And then we also have Jane Addams, who's one of the most influential members of the settlement house movement. Um, she founded Chicago's Hull House in 1889. And again, instrumental in helping some of the people, some of the poor. Um, so at the same time, we have kind of some of these problems of urbanization. This also leads to some issues in politics, and it's actually known as the Gilded Age here, where um, you have these immigrants and these migrants that came into cities. They're still poor. They're the urban poor now, and they have different needs, and it leads to a system where people can come in and take advantage of them. And so what they call political machines develop to take advantage of the needs of the immigrants and the urban poor, and increase power for themselves. If we look at a political machine, if we were to define that, it's one of your vocab terms. It's just an organized group that controls the activities of a political party in a city. And so it's kind of a corrupt way to look at politics. And so these political machines would prey basically on the needs of the immigrants and the poor. They would promise them things in return for votes, but they would basically kind of try to keep them down. And so then they would be able to continue to have power and control over them. Um, so you have that kind of developing. Um, Many of the the political machines relied on immigrants at the lower level to kind of um, help them stay in power. Um, so there's that going on. City politicians are going to use force and graft to maintain their political power. Um, Graft is something that's kind of hard to define. It's another one of your vocab terms, um, but graft is the illegal use of political influence for personal gain. So the book gives the example of uh, helping a person to find work on a construction project for the city. You could then ask the city or ask the worker to build a city for more than the actual cost of materials and labor. And then the worker would pay that political official what they would call a kickback. So basically, it was helping them make money at the expense of the city a little bit. So you have things like that happening, those corruption almost in the city happening, in numerous cities happening for things like that with the use of graft. And so that's not necessarily a good thing. You also had something known as patronage developing during this period as well. Um, Basically, patronage is just the giving of government jobs to people who had helped a candidate get elected. And so there's problems with that is you end up with people that aren't necessarily qualified doing a job because they just happen to be friends with somebody. So that there's a great deal of corruption developing, and people begin to call for civil service reform, where jobs would be awarded more on merit and less on who you knew. Um, so we start to see during this period some progress made on civil service reform. We have a Republican president, Rutherford B. Hayes, that's elected in 1876. He tries to convince Congress to support reform, but he's really unable to. But he does get a few things done, but he basically succeeds in ruffling some feathers when he's in office. But James A. Garfield and Chester A. Arthur come into office next. Um, so once kind of Garfield is elected, Garfield is one of our presidents that is assassinated, and it has to do with this patronage system. Garfield is actually once he's elected, he gives some jobs to people that upsets a well, somebody that was an opponent of Garfield. It's a mentally unstable lawyer, basically, who meets Garfield in a train station and um, shoots Garfield. I mean, this is a man that Garfield had turned down for a job, and Garfield ends up dying from his wounds. Chester A. Arthur, then, who was Garfield's vice president, becomes president. In his first message from Congress, he's going to urge them to pass civil service reform. And the resulting bill that was passed is the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. And it authorized a bipartisan civil service commission to make appointments to federal jobs through a merit system based on a candidate's performance on an examination. So by 1901, the effect of this is by 1901, more than 40% of all federal jobs had been classified as civil service positions. So there is some advantage to that, where more people are getting jobs based on merit. But the Pendleton Act had mixed consequences. Because again, on the one hand, you have public administration becoming more honest and efficient. However, because officials could no longer pressure employees for campaign contributions, candidates are going to look for other sources of income for their donations, and that's going to come in the form of big business, and big business is going to get involved in politics, and oftentimes the interests of big business and the interests of everyday people are going to conflict. And on one particular issue that conflicts is tariffs. Um, Big business had hoped that the government would preserve or even raise the tariffs that had protected the domestic industries from foreign competition for the last 50 years. The Democratic Party, however, opposed higher tariffs because they increased prices, and they were against that. In 1884, the Democratic Party won a presidential election for the first time in 28 years. It was Grover Cleveland who was elected. As president, Cleveland tried to lower tariffs, but Congress did not want to support him because, again, Congress is kind of now in bed with big business. They have gotten many members of Congress were elected because of their ties to big business. In 1888, Cleveland was going to run for re-election on a low tariff platform against the former Indiana senator by the name of Benjamin Harrison, who was the grandson of former President William Henry Harrison. Harrison's campaign is going to be financed largely by contributions from companies that wanted tariffs even higher than they currently were. So again, there's that conflict. Although Cleveland won 100,000 more popular votes than Mr. Harrison, Harrison took a majority of electoral votes and then consequently the presidency. He signed the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, which raised tariffs on manufactured goods to their highest level in years once he was in office. So again, the business interest was at conflict with what everyday people wanted. In 1892, after Harrison's term, Grover Cleveland runs again for president, and he's elected again, which he's the only president in our history to date that served 2 non-consecutive terms. He supported a bill for lowering the McKinley tariff, but when the bill sat before him, he refused to sign it because it also provided for a federal income tax, which Mr. Cleveland was against. The Wilson-Gorman tariff became law in 1894 without the president's signature, because he just didn't do anything with it. Then in 1897, William McKinley was inaugurated president, and he will raise the tariffs once again. So we have this kind of yo-yoing effect between, depending on who was in power, if they were going to have higher tariffs or lower tariffs. But so overall, these kind of attempts to reduce the tariffs, in this late 1800s failed. The spirit of reform was not dead. We had new developments in the areas of technology, and we start to see a new, distinctly different American culture that's developing here at the turn of the 20th century, and that will be the focus of our time capsule project.